Howdy y'all! Plot is a new mechanic with the release of Outlaws of Thunder Junction that allows you to pay a cost now and exile a card from your hand face up, and then play it at sorcery speed on a later turn. Exiling it this way notably protects the card from hand disruption and puts that looming threat on your opponent that the card could come down at any point in the near future. This is ideal for when you want to combine a card with other cards that can benefit from it, but you're currently restricted on your mana costs. This is also great for putting a card off to the side to refuel or re-establish a board if you anticipate certain spells coming from your opponent's side. So that gets us to the topic of today's video. Will Plot punish control decks? Specifically, how will it work in Pioneer? Although it's not the word-for-word post I saw on the r/Pioneer subreddit, user Bloomer Taxonomy was wondering if Plot was going to create scenarios where a control deck was going to be overrun with value from its opponents and get pushed out of the meta thanks to the new mechanic. It's not quite the same way that Cascade or Discover would work, but my short answer is no, not really. The longer answer, well, there's a few reasons why I think that. The first reason of these is the fact that while plot cards are exiled from your hand and will cost 0 mana when they are cast on a later turn, there isn't anything protecting them on the stack specifically. So that means that control deck's classic way of dealing with cards is still viable. Counter magic. Just because you aren't using mana doesn't mean it can't be absorbed. Now, this does open up your mana to be able to pay for specific types of counter magic, so there's a little bit of upside to this. However, to use this upside efficiently, you're taking 2 turns to cast 1 spell now, which isn't exactly where you want to be on board against a control deck, unless that spell is winning you the game. And that leads us into our second point, which is a little bit more obvious. There's just aren't that many threatening plot cards out there. Looking at the roster of cards, none of them really scream game-ending threat, which makes them less likely to be assessed as a problem by the control player. There are some cards that look pretty good, which we will address a little bit later, but even in the instances of a card like Make Your Own Luck being able to plot away something like an Atraxa to be cast later, the spell itself can be dealt with before the card it plots is ever even threatening to hit the table. However, let's talk about a hypothetical scenario where one of these overwhelming plot turns could happen, which I talked about with the original poster in the Reddit thread. Let's say somehow a deck is able to have a plotted Vein Ripper and has access to multiple spells in a turn. Something very scary like Fable the Mirror Breaker, and then also a Blood Tithe Harvester to be mana efficient. As the control player, you've been able to have your opponent take their entire turn 5 off to plot their Vein Ripper for their next turn, perhaps with a Make Your Own Luck in this magical Christmas land. Now this is a gold mine for control decks, as they love playing the draw, land, go game plan. This means with 4 open mana, your opponent essentially took their turn off to be able to cast their spell next turn. You can now cast any number of card advantage spells from this standpoint, such as Memory Deluge, to find cards that bolster your hand for the oncoming onslaught of a turn. When your opponent finally unleashes their fury, it really depends on the order they do it in. If they try to use small spells to bait out counter magic, that means you can just get rid of the big plotted spell with something cheap and efficient like No More Lies. If they play the other way around and cast the free spell first to have the mana open to pay for that, you can then use hard counter magic like Absorb instead. You might not even have to deal with the smaller creature threats if you have a Supreme Verdict in hand, or you can just use the Wandering Emperor to pick one off and make a sea of blockers for the other one. Of course, this requires the control player to have access to all of these cards, which isn't unlikely if we've just been playing Draw Go for a few turns and we just resolved the Memory Deluge. Heck, even with an Absorb, you can still have a Get Lost for just 2 mana to deal with the Fable of the Mirror Breaker itself, and then there's just 2 creatures on board. This also depends on the current state of the game in order to properly assess how powerful the plot turn really is. This turn looks tame when we're sitting at a cushy 20 life compared to facing down a turn like this at 1 life where any threat left on the table means instant death for us. Now, keeping these scenarios in mind, I do think that plot has 2 cases specifically where it can be powerful against control decks. One of those is going to be cheating cards into play. So the cards like Make Your Luck flipping over Atraxa Grand Unifier specifically is one of these scenarios. The fact that Atraxa not only demands answers, but also restocks the opponent's hand is a nightmare for a control deck player, even if they do answer the Phyrexian Angel cleanly. However, the hard part for your deck is going to be resolving Make Your Luck, a 5-mana spell, in the first place against the control deck. Rest in peace to Fairy Time Raveler. The other scenario I can think of involves plotting cards when you anticipate a play from the control deck. The best example I could think of this are the Boros and Izzet decks in Pioneer that will be utilizing Slick Shot Show Off as a plotted card in anticipation of something like a Supreme Verdict type board wipe. These decks specifically are aggressive, and while taking 2 mana off to plot a spell isn't the greatest spot for them to be in, if you do so after a Monastery Swiftspear or a Soul Scar Mage or both have been played and beating down with the help of some cheap burn spells, it puts the control player in a bit of a pickle. Do they wipe the board and tap out, letting Slick Shot resolve with potentially 4 open mana and cards in hand? This gets even trickier if you're able to slip through something like a Light Up the Stage on the same turn. One last corner case that isn't really using the plot mechanic to set a control deck behind, more so than it is a way to interact directly with their counter magic, is Even Interrupter. Now, Even Interrupter basically makes counter spells completely null and void, functioning as another kind of spell queller in these Azorius and Bant type lists. By using Interrupter to exile a counterspell, that card becomes plotted, meaning it can only be cast at sorcery speed. So effectively, the card does nothing, unless it comes in a secret lair. Now overall, the plot mechanic seems like it's pretty fun and feels really thematic, down to the card being face up and even having plot armor so it can't be discarded. I don't think the mechanic is backbreaking against control decks, however, and it's just another card they're going to have to consider when going about their turns and lining up the spells that they have in mind to cast. Taking turns off and letting the control deck untapped unscathed isn't the greatest, and we have had control versus combo in the format for a while to have examples of how overwhelming them with spells in a turn doesn't really matter as much as having the right ones at the right time, or if they have the correct answers for the correct scenario. So what do you think? Is plot something you're looking forward to using? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. As always, tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on more deck techs, metagame analysis, and in general, Magic content. Y'all come back now you're here.